Okay, so Noah has a bloodline, and we heard about his grandsons, Mozak and Tubal, his great-grandson, who was Jemshid's father, and then we heard about Jemshid, which is his great-great-grandson. Now, we're going to hear about the Tower of Babel. The Tower of Babel, subtext. The building of the Tower of Babel was the work of pride. The builders aimed at constructing something according to their own ideas, and thus resisted the guidance of God. When the children of Noah had become very numerous, the proudest and most experienced among them met to resolve upon the execution of some work so great and so strong as to be the wonder of all ages to come, and cause the builders to be spoken of as the most skillful, the most powerful of men. They thought not of God. They sought only their own glory. Had it been otherwise, as I was distinctly told, God would have allowed their undertaking to succeed. The children of Shem took no active part in the work. They dwelt in a level country where palm trees and similar choice fruit grow. They were, however, obliged to contribute something toward the building, for they did not dwell so far distant at that period as they did later. The descendants of Ham and Japhet alone were engaged in the work, and because the Semites refused to join them, they called them a stupid race. The Semites were less numerous than the children of Ham and Japhet, and among them, the family of Heber and the ancestors of Abraham studiously refrained from encouraging the enterprise. Upon Heber, who, as we have said, took no part in the work, God cast his eyes, and amid the general disorder and corruption, he set him and his posterity apart as a holy nation. God gave him also a new and holy language possessed by no other nation, and that thereby his race should be cut off from communication with all others. The language was the pure Hebrew or Chaldaic. The first tongue, the mother tongue, spoken by Adam, Shem, and Noah, was different, and it is now extant only in isolated dialects. Its first pure offshoots are the Zend, the sacred tongue of India, and the language of the Bactrians. In those languages, words may be found exactly similar to the Low German of my native place. The book that I see in modern Ctesiphon, with a silent C, on the Tigris is written in that language. Heber was still living at the time of Semiramis. His grandfather Arphaxad was the favorite son of Shem. He was a man of great judgment and full of profound wisdom, but a good deal of idolatrous worship and sorcery may have been handed down by him. The Magi derived their origin from him. The Tower of Babel, or Babel, was built upon rising ground, about 2 leagues in circumference, around which lay an extensive plain covered with fields, gardens, and trees. To the foundations of the tower that is up to its first story, 25 very broad stone walks led them to all sides of the plain. 25 tribes were engaged in the building, and each tribe had its own road to the tower. Off in the distance, where these roads began, Each tribe had its own particular city, that, in time of danger or attack, they might flee to the tower for shelter. The tower was intended likewise to serve as a temple for their idolatrous worship. The stone roads were, where they took their rise in the plain, tolerably far apart, but around the tower they lay so close that the intervening spaces were not greater than the breadth of a wide street. Before reaching the tower, they were connected by cross arches, and between every two there opened a gateway about 10 feet wide into its base. When these gently inclined roads had reached a certain height, they were pierced by single arcades near the tower. The arcades were doubled, one above the other, so that through them one could make the circuit of the building even around the lowest part, under all the roads. Above the arches that connected the inclined roads were walks or streets running horizontally around the tower. Those gently rising roads extended like the roots of a tree. They were designed in part as supporting counter pillars to strengthen the foundation of the immense building, and partly as roads for the conveyance from all points of building materials and other loads to the first story of the tower. Between these extended bases were encampments upon substructures of stone, and in many places the tops of the tents rose above the roads that ran through them. From every encampment, steps cut in the walls led up to the walks. One could go all around the tower, through the encampments and arches, and under the stone roads. Besides the occupants of the encampments, there were others who lived in the vaults and spaces on either side of the stone roads. In and around the whole building swarmed innumerable living things. It was like a huge anthill. Countless elephants, asses, and camels toiled up and down the roads with their heavy burdens. Although these burdens were far broader than the animals themselves, yet several could with ease pass one another on the roads. On them were halting places for feeding and unloading the animals, also tents on the level spaces, and even factories. I saw animals without a guide bearing their burdens up and down. The gateways in the basement of the tower led into a labyrinth of halls, passages, and chambers. From this lower part of the tower, one could mount by steps cut out on all sides. A spiral walk wound from the first story around the exterior of the polygonal building. The interior at this point consisted of cellars, immense and secure, covered chambers, and passages. The building was begun on all sides at once. All tended to one central point, where at first stood a large encampment. They used tiles, also immense, hewed stones, which they hauled to the site. The surface of the walks was quite white, and it glistened in the sun. At a distance, the sight it presented was wonderful. The tower was planned most skillfully. I was told that it would have been finished and would now be standing as a magnificent monument of human skill, had it been erected in the honor or to the honor of God. But the builders thought not of God. Their work was the offspring of presumption. The names of those that had contributed to the grandeur and magnificence of the building were inscribed with words of praise in the vaults and on the pillars. In the former, by means of different colored stones, and on the latter in large characters. There were no kings, but only the heads of the different families. and they ruled according to common counsel. The stones employed in the building were skillfully wrought. They fitted into one another, held one another together. There were no raised figures on the building, but many parts of it were inlaid with colored stones, and here and there were figures hewn in niches. Canals and cisterns were constructed for water supplies. All lent a helping hand. Even the women trod the clay with their feet. The men worked with breast and arms bare, the most distinguished wearing a little cap with a button. Even in very early times, women kept the head covered. The building so increased in bulk and height that on account of the shade it cast, it was quite cold on one side, while on the other, the reflection of the sun's rays made it very hot. For 30 years the work went on. They were at the second story. They had already encircled and walled in the interior with tower-like columns, had already recorded their names and races thereon in colored stone, when the confusion broke forth. I saw one sent by God, Melchizedek, going around among the leaders and the masters of the building. He called upon them to account for their conduct, and he announced to them the chastisement of God. And now began the confusion. Many who had up to this time, worked on peaceably, now boasted of their skill and the great services they had rendered in the undertaking. They formed parties. They laid claim to certain privileges. This occasioned contradictions, animosities, and rebellion. There were at first only 2 tribes among the disaffected, and these, it was resolved, should be put down. But soon it was discovered that disunion existed among all. They struggled among themselves. They slew one another. They could no longer make themselves understood by one another, and so at last they separated and scattered over the whole earth. I saw Shem's race going farther southward, where later on was Abraham's home. I saw one of Shem's race. He was a good man, but he did not follow his leader. On account of his wife, he preferred staying among the wicked ones of Babel. He became the leader of the Semenenses, a race that always held themselves aloof from the others. Under the cruel Semiramis, Melchizedek transplanted them to Palestine. When in my childhood I had the vision of the building of the tower, I used to reject it because I could not understand it. I had, of course, seen nothing like it, no buildings, but our farmhouses whence the cows go out by the fireplace, and the city of Coesfeld. More than once I thought it must be heaven, but I had the vision again and again, and always in the same way I see it still, and I have also seen how it looked in Job's time. One of the chief leaders in the tower building was Nimrod. He was afterward honored as a deity under the name of Belus. He was the founder of the race that honored Derketo and Semiramis as goddesses. He built Babylon out of the stones of the tower, and Semiramis greatly embellished it. He also laid the foundation of Nineveh and built substructures of stone for tent dwellings. He was a great hunter and tyrant. At that period, savage animals were very numerous, and they committed fearful ravages. The hunting expeditions fitted out against them were as grand as military expeditions. Those who slew these wild animals were honored as gods. Nimrod also drove men together and subdued them. He practiced idolatry. He was full of cruelty and witchcraft, and he had many descendants. He lived to be about 270 years old. He was of sallow complexion, and from early youth he had led a wild life. He was an instrument of Satan and very much given to star worship. Of the numerous figures and pictures that he traced in the planets and constellations, and according to which he prophesied concerning the different nations and countries, he sought to reproduce representations which he set up as gods. The Egyptians owe their sphinx to him, as also their many-armed and many-headed idols. For 70 years Nimrod busied himself with the histories of these idols, with ceremonial details relative to their worship and the sacrifices to be offered them, also with the forming of the pagan priesthood. By his diabolical wisdom and power, he had subjected the races that he led to the building of the tower. When the confusion of tongues arose, many of those tribes broke away from him, and the wildest of them followed Mizraim into Egypt. Nimrod built Babylon, subjected the country around, and laid the foundation of the Babylonian Empire. Among his numerous children were Ninus and Derketo. The last mentioned was honored as a goddess. End of reading. Okay, so my notes are extensive today, as you'll see by the length of the video clearly. I mean, how often do we get to do Babel? And Babel is extremely prophetic in our times, right? The whole world is trying to come together in a new world order that's and based on this, all this technology and whatnot, to build these huge cities and skyscrapers and rockets that'll take us to Mars and all that stuff. It's all Babel building. And Babel building it's a term I draw from Genesis 11, because it's almost like, I almost feel like we're going through, in the last times in the apocalypse, we're going through Genesis backwards. Like after Jesus came, we started at Genesis 50, and then, you know, the first eras, they were Genesis 49, 48, and it counted backwards. And now we're all the way to basically Genesis 12 or 11, where and 12 was Abraham, the introduction of Abraham, and 11 is the construction of Babel. So it's like perhaps Abraham is about to disperse or whatever, and then now we have the global unity attempted, the New World Order. Everybody knows about the New World Order now. I mean, if you talked about it 25 years ago, people would have thought, man, you're one of those guys. Now, if you talk about the New World Order, it's like, yeah. Because we've seen examples of it. So anyways, next note, I related to Revelation 17, the whore riding the beast. The beast realizes after a time it's working for the whore, and then he tosses her off. And I don't know if he eats her, but the whore always seems to, the whore of Babylon, the false prophet, always seems to die by her own machinations or her creations. So when it came to Jezebel fell out the window, and then she was eaten by dogs, and her corpse was so eaten by dogs that they couldn't recognize it from common bones in the field. So it's just like it's the fitting end for the whore, and it always seems to be the end for the whore, that she dies such an ungraceful death, and she gets disintegrated in a way. So God disrupts it in Genesis 11. He says, let us go down. And a lot of people, they make a big fuss about let us. There are two really marquee times where this is done in Genesis. The first time you'll see in Genesis 1, near the end of it, let us make humankind. And the reason why is because, and we'll go over this Trinity, right? There's the the true Trinity and the false Trinity. I'll get into that way later. But he says, let us create humankind. And when he means us, well, you see in the first 5 days, he says, let the earth do this. Let the earth spring forth trees. Let the earth spring forth waters. Let the earth spring forth the animals. But then when it comes to creating mankind, it's let us make humankind. To say that humankind is a hybrid between what the earth made, which is the material, and what God made, which is the spiritual. When God breathes air into us, he infuses us with spirit, with soul. The air, the breath in our lungs is a representation of the spirit. And Jesus, again, likens the spirit to air, the element of air, the element of oxygen or whatnot. When he says in John 3:8, the wind blows where it wills and it goes, and no one knows whither it comes or whence it goes. And so it is with those born of the Spirit, which likens the Spirit to air, that the air is like an invisible force. We don't see it. We hear the sound of it, but we don't know where it's coming or where it's going. So we hear the sound of spirituality, but we don't know what it's up to. And so we have this God hybridizes with the spirit hybridizes with the material, and we create humankind. Well, here in Genesis 11, he says, let us. And then we see in Genesis 15, when the angels go and visit Abraham, there's 3 of them. And she says, well, it's like there's 3 angels that visited Noah to give him the chalice when we did the 6th vision there. So, let us just means like he's speaking through the angels in this case. Let's see. Oh, yeah, and we get introduced to Melchizedek. Now, Melchizedek is obviously an extremely different figure. He's a God-man. We don't have his origins. The Bible doesn't give his origins, and neither do these visions. They just say he's like a priest, like he came down from heaven. What is this guy? We sort of have the same mystery when it comes to Enoch, because Enoch gets taken up. He doesn't actually die. He walks with God now. So they're obviously mysterious figures. Next note. Okay, this one. The only hope of unity in this world, and we use the word globalist as like a dirty word. I like to use modernist, but globalist as a dirty word. But globalist is actually like, we can use globalist or Pentecostal. And I don't mean the religion Pentecostalism. I mean true Pentecost, like the Holy Spirit's Pentecost. And that's the only hope of unity. The Pentecost is a movement, a spiritual movement, while the New World Order will be a material movement, a Babylon. In our times, our New World Order is not the Pentecostal world order that God wants. This is the whore of Babylon riding the beast. I say here, the whole book of the Apocalypse is like a tale of 2 cities. The holy city, which is the virginal one with a singular devotion to God, an icon of Mary, the Blessed Virgin. And then we have the unholy, and it's Revelation 7:14 and 21. The holy city, we see it, and we see the virgins, the martyrs, the red and white, the martyrdoms, the virgins. These are really important. And then we have the unholy city, which is the whore who sleeps around with all the other religions and calls them all useful, all good, and all leading to God. The whore we can really call Freemasonry in our times. Freemasonry is sort of like the false prophet, but we specifically and very specifically point to those who call themselves the Jews, which we hear about in Revelation 3 when he's addressing the 6th church and the 3rd one. So The false, and I think it's Jeremiah 51. We'll get, we read all about the whore. And we know that it's tied to the city of Jerusalem. So, the beast is the secular world order built by the various revolutions of the Masons. The beast, to me, is best identified by this democracy that we now have all over the world. If we're living in a democratic country that is a bottom-up order rather than a top-down God-appointed order, we know that we've been whored into existence by the Freemasons, or the Freemasonic secular movement. Now, the next point, one of the children of Freemasonry is the cultural Marxism, which sort of embodies the beast in many ways, which is why our times are like Babel. When you sacrifice truth for power and materialism, well, you sacrifice the spirit for the flesh. Well, now everyone speaks in a common and extremely mundane language. And there's no morality anymore, while everyone can just go sin equally. But then you start talking of mystical things, and confusion arises. That's why we talk about religion and everyone clenches, gets all discomforted, like you're the rude awakening in a world that is stuck in what seems to be in a pleasant dream. Although this pleasant dream is quickly coming to an end in our times. But that pleasant dream was given to us by the whore. Look at all these fantastic things we're giving you. This technology, medicine, and all that stuff. But it's all just a pleasant serenade. Till people realize everything is corrupted. Next point. Organically, any system built by men is doomed to crumble. Not because God knocks it over, but because men sabotage themselves with original sin. And until that is cured, we live as the fragments of that thing that works towards our own destruction. When we build or unite to build Babel, there are only two possibilities. We either all we all destroy each other, or we all fragment. There's only those two conclusions. We can never fully build Babel properly. But people don't understand this. So this is what I believe happens to the Protestants who claim to be Christians, or what happened to the Samaritans, which is the kingdoms of Israel that decided to split from the line of Judah. The Protestants are the kingdom of the Christians that decided to split from the Catholics. We also have the Eastern Orthodox and the Anglicans, which have unfortunately fragmented as well. Now they attempt to come to their own understanding of God through their own understanding of Holy Writ. But then causes a confusion among one another, and they fragment because each Protestant wants to preserve a particular sin or imperfection. They seem to aspire for mediocrity. And that kind of mediocrity is condemned by the Catholic faith, which is difficult to practice. We, for example, value the virtue of chastity. Yes, it's a very important virtue. So, let's get to more interesting stuff. Next point. The circumference of the tower is about 4.5 kilometers, which means the diameter of the tower would have been just shy of 1.5 kilometers. To contrast, we can take a large stadium like the Rungrado 1st of May in North Korea in Pyeongchang, which looks about 600 meters or so in diameter. It's a pretty big building at the base anyways. And that's 600 meters. This thing would have been less than half the length of the Tower of Babel. Okay, what about Madison Square Garden? It's just over 100 meters in diameter. How about the tall building, Burj Khalifa? It's just about 100 meters wide at its base. Okay? It has like a triangular base. And then we have the longest cruise ship in the world is about 375 meters. And anyone who's been on a cruise ship knows they're like floating palaces. They have like 3,000 rooms or whatever. And that, yeah, the Great Pyramid of Giza is just over 200 meters wide. Like if you took its borders, its sides, just over 200 meters at its base. So Babel, we have to understand, would have been enormous. The tower would have been enormous. No one, even in our times, has attempted this kind of construction. Now, as we all know from Genesis 11, they were using baked clay, and this would harden clay and burn out all the impurities that made it softer. Now, keep in mind that steel, which is what we use to build our skyscrapers, is like baked iron. Think about that. We just super roast iron and then it becomes steel. So, people, next point. People make a big deal out of language. Now, I won't say a stupid statement like language is just a means for communication. No, there's a lot of what's in the languages seems to be of divine origin, or at least of angelic origin, because it's extremely organized and orchestrated, but each of them stylistically different, almost as if every language is built to revere a particular thing, or to bring out of a person a particular habit or attitude. Now, the study of linguistics tells us how the philosophies used in communications are intrinsic to how a language shapes our minds, and how when we're multilingual, we start to break those boundaries set up by our own languages. Now, obviously, when we're talking about globalism, we have everyone learning English, and English is the language I'm speaking. When we learn English, well, we all sort of get dumbed down in a way. But English is a wide varied language. It has like 200,000 words, where your standard language has maybe 50,000. So we know from exorcists, however, that Latin is a powerful language. When you pray in Latin, it has might, it has domination. Just when you hear Latin being spoken, it does possess that power. It's like an intrinsic language of power. And it perhaps might have been why Romans were so powerful. Now, obviously, Aramaic will have a different sort of power. Perhaps Aramaic is sort of like the shepherd's language, right? And Hebrew will be more like the Palestinian language. And we can break down the Latin languages, like we might call Italian the language of songs or poetry, French the language of beauty, Spanish the language of romance, kind of thing. I don't know. People have different opinions on those things, but maybe they see French as the romantic language. And if you learn, say, that Portuguese, Italian, and French, you'll see vast differences in the philosophies of these languages. So, and each of them seems to serve their people in the way they need to. But keep also in mind that every language gets deformed over time, dialectically simplified, so no language is truly preserved 100%. I speak English, and if my videos for some reason lasted 300 years, people might speak a different English than what I currently speak. We understand English from 300 years ago pretty easily now, of course. It's preserved over time. We have excellent preservation since the printing press. And we have excellent preservation of the ancient languages thanks to the work of the the monks in Ireland who preserved a lot of the Homer and the Odyssey and all that stuff. But let's say you want to test this. Go read for example, the autobiography of Ben Franklin. Pretty interesting read there. But you'll see how he speaks very different English to how we speak. They use a lot of surnames back then, which maybe it's something we should bring back. Anyways, you can easily check how English has changed in just a quarter millennium. I mean, you could read Shakespeare and see how it's changed vastly in a half millennium. Now, language is less likely to get deformed, I believe, the more virtuous a civilization is. Whereas the less virtuous it is, because, and it's just a contrast between humility and pride. When you're humble, you obey, you submit. When you're proud, you create your own domains. So when you're proud, you obviously want to create new languages or to bend the language so as to make you sound as the most intelligent person in the world. And this is often what creates barriers in pseudo-intellectual arguments that you see on philosophy room forums where everybody just sort of tries to dominate each other. And what do? They come up with these new isms, and they throw a pile of isms at you, and you're like, what is that word? And that's how they dominate you. They create new language to try to dominate. So when people are trying to set the parameters of the language, this is a form of pride and domination. If, however, you come up with terms like Babel building like I do, well, I'm just drawing from Genesis 11. So when I say Babel building, you know exactly what I mean. So let's keep going. Now we go, a humble race like the Semites might have added to Hebrew, but they wouldn't have transformed it like the ancient languages. I'm guessing Aramaic was one of them, would have been transformed by the dialects. So next note. People obsess over this, but really we should not. I'll tell you why. First of all, Jesus and Mary had infused knowledge. They were not humans like us, who organically developed intelligence. Now, they had it infused in their womb. They knew a lot. Mary was smarter as a seed in her womb than us humans will ever be. This was dictated to us in Mystical City of God because she had infused knowledge. Now, infused knowledge is very much a thing in the Catholic Church. We've had a lot of people who wanted to become priests, but they had trouble keeping up with the philosophies and whatnot in seminaries, and they prayed to God, and then all of a sudden they have infused knowledge and they have new understanding of, and this is a miracle. Okay, this isn't just, oh, well, suddenly they just learned better. No, this is a miracle. These people were dumb beforehand, and then they suddenly became smart. I don't mean dumb by they can't speak, but I mean just kind of stupid. Now, to think that Jesus exclusively spoke Aramaic or Hebrew is short-sighted. We can't place limits on things that we don't know. We don't know how this happened. Perhaps he spoke Latin with Latins, Greek with Greeks. We know that he spoke all these languages. He was a supreme intellect. And when we communicate, even when exorcists communicate with demons, demons can talk in whatever language they want. Father Chad Ripperger said there was this woman speaking. This is how one of the ways they check to see how a person is demonically possessed. When they start talking in languages they could not possibly know. He said one of the languages they were talked to in was a 3,000 year extinct form of Syro-Phoenician, something like 2,500 or 3,000 year old language. So we know that languages come easy to spirits. They just learn everything. We obsess over it, but really it's just, we have to study it. We have to contemplate it, but we can't say for sure, well, this is what it was. The Pentecostal gift in itself tells us that the apostles were infused with knowledge to speak these languages. But we also have saints, great saints, mind you, with the Pentecostal gift. This is a gift where St. Vincent of Ferrer is a perfect example of this. When he sermoned, when he gave his homilies and his great sermons to thousands of people, all of them understood every single thing he said, even though he spoke in Latin. So what this means is they understood him, although they did not speak in Latin, but they understood him. That was, it's a gift of the Holy Spirit, like a miracle. So, even if Mary and Jesus did not speak in languages, they could have, and if they spoke to each other, I don't imagine in private they would have spoken languages. They would have just looked at each other and understood everything each other wanted to say, right? The information would have been transmitted in a perfect way we would have no comprehension of. So, maybe they spoke that ancient Semitical Hebrew, and everyone just understood them as if they were understanding Pentecostally, like they were listening to St. Vincent of Ferrer. So, let's not put handcuffs on Jesus. That's my point. Next point. Holy Writ goes out of its way to make certain statements. Jesus on the cross, third thing said. Quotes a psalm in Aramaic. Now, it goes out of its way to say he quotes in Aramaic. Why? Why would they say in Aramaic? Why wouldn't they just say, and he said this? Well, he's quoting the psalm in the language it was written in, perhaps, in Aramaic by King David. Father, Father, why hast thou forsaken me? Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. Right? It's, and I might have butchered that, but doesn't matter. You know my point. In Mystical City of God, when we read that, Archangel Gabriel in the Annunciation, he may have spoke to Mary those words in Latin. Ave Maria, gratia plena, Dominus tecum. Right? And then she might have answered in the fiat. Fiat mihi secundum verbum tuum. Right? It's just, maybe she did dictate that in Latin because they used it. And we know that souls just communicate. They don't talk like humans talk. But we hear words for our sake, not for theirs. So it's for our sake that we were given the Latin language to preserve the faith. And we have to understand that God comes down from heaven. We don't go up to him, which is the idea of Babylon, which is building up a tower to reach heaven. But God comes down to us. What does that mean? It means he dumbs himself down for us to understand. Language just happens to be the means in which it's done, but it's a means, not the means. Catechesis is an invisible thing, like air, spirituality. There's people that talk the gospel, and there's people that live it in their hearts. If you want to get a true catechesis, you want to witness someone that lives the gospel, and you want to live it yourself. Last point, the Antichrist, Nimrod. Nimrod seems to be the first true Antichrist figure. We've had plenty since, like Antiochus and There's some German emperors that were really Antichrist and whatnot. Okay? So we have to understand it in this way. You have the Holy Trinity, which loves the holy city, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, who loves Mary as a princess of the Most High, the spouse of the Holy Spirit, and the mother of God. And then you have an unholy Trinity. This was what I was alluding to earlier. We have examples of this in the Bible, like Ahab, Jezebel, and the priests of Baal, or the even just the followers of Baal. Or like Herod, Herodias, and the daughter of Herodias, Salome, who kills the prophets. Remember that the false prophet kills the true prophets. So Herodias killed John the Baptist. Jezebel was attacking all the prophets and tried to go after Elijah. Now, in the apocalypse, we have the unholy Trinity. I call it the unholy Trinity. The mother is the false prophet. The father is the ancient serpent or the red dragon. And the son is the beast that rises from the sea or that rises from the bottomless pit. We already met with Ham, who was a false prophet, and other false prophets. We're about to meet in Derketo and Semiramis. But when we see a great Antichrist figure in Nimrod, who is the male. Perhaps the first great one might have been Lamech of Genesis 4. It has this primal domination, but we didn't get anything on Lamech in Catherine's visions. The serpent is someone who openly worships the devil in a mystical way. The false prophet is someone who translates the teachings in a material way and manifests it like they know each other and they beget a child. And the child that comes out of the womb is a beast. And keep in mind the beast. Because the son of this primal behavior is cut off from God and he goes wild. He's not noble. He is a beast, a wild animal. In Apocalypse, the whore of Babylon is the false prophet. She rides her child, the beast, with 7 heads and 10 horns. We know now that the 7 heads represent the nations, probably the secularist nations, the great nations of our secularist times. The 10 horns are 10 future kings of Antichrist, come in the next era. The father is the red dragon, who also has the 7 heads and 10 horns. And you can see that each head seems to represent a particular anti-commandment, while the first head, which with the 4 horns, represents the first tablet, but it's idolatry rather than the true first tablet, which is, you shall have only one God. As the father, the red dragon has the 4 heads, the four commandments, but they're anti-commandments. Swear all you like, blaspheme all you like, have as many gods as you like, and worship the dragon only. Worship Satan only. It's like I always say, Satan bets the field against God. So, Nimrod was primal. He was a hunter. He was a controller. He was a dominator. He subjugates people. He subjugates this kingdom. Does not bow to anybody, everyone bows to him. Which contrasts also Esau and Jacob. Jacob was a hunter out in the field hunting beasts. Sound familiar? Yeah, Nimrod was doing the same thing. Right? You're preoccupied with external things that, like you're an adrenaline junkie just trying to get highs from living this life. But you're chasing only after what the moth eats, right? The mammons of this world. Whereas Jacob was an indoor person, contemplative. He lived in the tents. We still have these types in our times. The Esau's go out and prove to the world they're what they are, how manly they are by accomplishing athletic feats. They're based. While the Jacobs, they're the nerds that stay inside and read all the time, or the monks that like to sing and whatnot. Well, I mean, it still persists to this day that the oldest born tends to be the most material person in the family. It just happens that way. while the younger borns, they tend to be more mystical. And the reason why is because they can't beat the oldest born with might, so they have to turn to other methods of doing things. They know what it's like to be dominated, whereas the firstborn tends to dominate. It's like an ingrained thing in humanity. And this is why firstborn, secondborns, middle children, youngest borns, we all have the certain psychology that just applies to us a lot more faithfully than astrology. Most certainly. Anyways, sorry for the extensive notes, but we only get Babylon once, and Babylon is extremely important. So, Ave Maria.